Hello, I am Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is on It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free by William Wordsworth, an English poet. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and find it useful. Remember that you will never be examined on historical details or background information on a poet. However, if you understand the poet and their context, it makes understanding their poetry much easier. William Wordsworth is an English poet who was born on the 7th of April 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, England. This is part of the scenic Lake District, and the area deeply shaped his poetic imagination. The Lake District is extremely beautiful, and it was when he grew up here that he developed an attitude of awe and reverence for the natural world. For Wordsworth, nature in general, and the Lake District in particular, was his muse or his source of inspiration. His love of nature and wide open spaces was reinforced when he went on a walking tour of Europe. And while he was on his tour, he met many radical and revolutionary thinkers who had a great influence on him, particularly on him becoming a romantic poet. He was influenced by the revolutionary ideals of the French Revolution, and he later returned to France to find out more about the revolution. This is where he met Annette Vallon, who was the mother of his daughter Caroline. So it was a combination of revolutionary ideas and his upbringing in the spectacularly beautiful landscape that you can see in the picture on the left that shaped Wordsworth and shaped his writing. And you will see many of these influences in his poetry and in his poem, It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free. Wordsworth was the second of 5 children and was very close to his sister Dorothy, who was a major influence on his work. He started writing poetry when he was very young, and he had an excellent education which contributed to his writing. He attended grammar school in Hawkshead and later studied at St. John's College in Cambridge. Wordsworth and another English author, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, wrote an important book called Lyrical Ballads. It was so influential that it is considered to have brought about English Romanticism. Wordsworth once described the act of writing poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, which means basically that he wrote from what he cared about and felt strongly about, and then afterwards he edited and thought about it carefully. Something like the writing process that we are continuously reminding you to follow. He was a typical romantic poet because he was deeply spiritual and religious, in that he felt that he was closest to God and an experience of the divine when he was experiencing wild and untamed nature. His poetry often reflects a spiritual and philosophical commentary on nature, which he saw as a moral and spiritual guide, and he explores themes like individualism, honoring one's emotions and instincts, and exploring the nature of memory and the workings of the human mind, ideas that you will see in It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free. He died in Rydal Mount, Westmoreland, surrounded by the beautiful landscape of the Lake District that he had loved so much and had written so much about. And again, you can see a picture of the Lake District on the left. This is the story behind the poem. William Wordsworth had returned to Calais in France in 1802. He'd gone to visit Caroline, his 9-year-old daughter, from a past relationship with a French woman called Annette Vallon. He had loved Annette Vallon when he went to France to find out more about the French Revolution in 1792. She was related to the French royal family and was an aristocrat. He had a relationship with her, but because of political tensions and his financial hardship, Wordsworth had to leave France early in their relationship. Years later, he was able to revisit France and his 9-year-old daughter. That visit was a very rare moment when he had managed to return to France very briefly so that he could visit her. He went for a walk on the beach with Caroline, and afterwards he reflected on the beauty of the experience and what he saw as his daughter's divine nature. And that reflection is in the poem, It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free. To get you into the mood to appreciate Wordsworth's poem, I suggest that you stop this presentation when I've finished speaking and make some brief notes in response to this question. Have you ever sat outside in a beautiful natural setting and felt awe at what you were looking at? You could have been looking at any natural environment. I've just included this picture of a starry night sky to give you a little bit of inspiration. Think about that moment and jot down some notes on how the experience made you feel. And then when you're ready, continue to play the video. And hopefully you will see some links between your feelings and the way that Wordsworth felt when he was walking on that beach in Calais. As I read the poem, think about how Wordsworth, deeply moved by an evening's tranquility and feeling as though he is in the presence of God, reflects on the holiness of nature and the difference between how he experiences God and how his daughter, a child, experiences God or a sense of the divine. And I know that you may not be religious, so you might find this quite a difficult poem to relate to. But even if you're not religious, I think we can all relate to that feeling of being very small and very insignificant when we are faced with the enormity and the scale of the universe and the cosmos, and how brief and small our lives are in comparison. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free, by William Wordsworth. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. The broad sun is sinking down in its tranquility. The gentleness of heaven broods o'er the sea. Listen, the mighty being is awake, and doth with his eternal motion make a sound like thunder, everlastingly. Dear child, dear girl, that walkest with me here, if thou appear untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshippest at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not. As I analyze the poem, I suggest that you take notes, highlight key phrases, and also make sure that you understand the technical language terms that I will use. I will remind you what those terms mean when I use them, and I suggest that you write down any definitions that you did not already know. This is because it's very difficult to analyze literature and poetry if you cannot use the correct vocabulary. It is also a good idea to work with a copy of the poem in front of you, because then it's much easier for you to take notes. Before I move on to the next slide, I suggest that you look at your copy of the poem and count the number of lines in the poem, count the number of syllables in each line, and use the ABC method to take notes of the rhyme scheme. All of these aspects are important for the discussion of the poem's structure, which follows on the next slide. And if you're wondering what a syllable is, remember that it is the smallest unit of sound that a word can be broken down into. For example, the first line of the poem is, "It is a beauteous evening, calm and free." And you can hear that it consists mostly of single-syllable words, except for beauteous and evening, which would have both been pronounced with 2 syllables each. So beauteous and evening. You can hear it when I say the words in a slightly exaggerated way. When you counted the lines in the poem, you would have noticed that it has 14 lines with 10 syllables per line. I've written the number of syllables in red in brackets after each line. You will see that in order to have 10 syllables in a line, some words are reduced in syllable count when you pronounce them. For example, beauteous in line 1 can be said as 2 syllables, beauteous, or 3 syllables, beauteous. But it is said as 2 syllables because that fits in with the rhythm that is created by 10 syllables per line. This is also why worshipst in line 10 has been contracted or shortened by replacing the E after ship in worship with an apostrophe. That turns the 3-syllable word worshippest into a 2-syllable word worshipst, which fits with the regular rhythm created by the 10 syllables in each line. Although people naturally use contractions, for example, you would generally say can't rather than cannot when you're speaking, contractions are also very useful if you're a poet who's trying to achieve a certain number of syllables in each line. And when writing contains 10 syllables per line, and it is read in such a way that every second syllable is stressed, then it is written in iambic pentameter. You may know that pent means 5 in Latin. Think of your study of shapes in geometry. A pentagon has 5 sides. And you may be wondering why this is called pentameter, which means 5, when there are 10 syllables in each line. Why isn't it called decameter? This is because the 5 refers to 5 pairs of syllables, where you have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Each pair is called an iamb, and it creates a rhythm a bit like a heartbeat. Because if you feel your heartbeat, you will notice that you have a soft beat followed by a hard beat. Da-dum. This creates a very regular de-dum rhythm, where each de-dum in each line, and where you've got 5 pairs of them, emphasizes that heartbeat of the poem and also reinforces the peaceful and thoughtful tone of the poem because it's such a regular rhythm. You would have also noticed that the 10-syllable lines are quite long, especially as Wordsworth uses long words with long vowel sounds like adoration and tranquility. This makes the rhythm very, very slow, which adds to that meditative or thoughtful tone. If you're interested in the power of the iambic rhythm and how it can be used to write rap music or any music, I suggest that you search Akala, spelled A-K-A-L-A, Shakespeare, hip-hop, video on the internet. Akala is a brilliant rap artist, and he really explains iambic rhythm very well in a TED Talk video that you will find on the internet. As you counted the lines in the poem, you would have seen that the poem has 14 lines. The regular rhythm structure, the 14 lines, and the fact that it's written in iambic pentameter are all characteristics of a sonnet. But sonnets are love poems, and this poem isn't a love poem, I hear you cry. I do agree that this isn't a traditional love poem written to a romantic interest, but as we discuss the poem, consider the possibility that it is still a love poem. It's just addressed to an unusual audience. When you analyzed the rhyme scheme, you would have seen that it divides the poem into 2 parts. First, there are 8 lines with a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, C, C, A. These 8 lines focus on the beauty of nature surrounding Wordsworth and how nature makes him feel as though he's in the presence of God. The last 6 lines have the rhyme scheme of D, E, F, D, F, E, and they focus on Wordsworth's thoughts about the way his daughter experiences God in the divine and the divine. And in case you don't know how to analyze a rhyme scheme, here's a quick reminder. You look at the last word of each line, starting with line 1. Line 1 ends in the word free. Because it is the first line of the poem, it's given the first letter of the alphabet, which is A. Every other line that ends in a word that rhymes with free is given an A as well. So line 4, tranquility, and line 5, sea, and line 8, everlastingly, all rhyme with free, so they all get A's. Line 2 ends in none, which does not rhyme with free in line 1, so it gets the next letter of the alphabet, which is B. The word none in line 2 rhymes with sun in line 3, so they both get a B. Every time you get to a line that doesn't rhyme with the last words of any of the previous lines, it gets the next letter of the alphabet. And you might be wondering why line 10, which ends in thought, gets the same letter as line 14, which ends in not, when they don't really rhyme. If you were wondering, well spotted. Firstly, with Wordsworth's broad accent, which would have been a North Country English accent, the rhyme would have been closer if he had been reading the poem. But also, this rhyme is known as a half rhyme or a slant rhyme, which basically means a kind of rhyme, and it gets the same letter as it still fits into the rhyme scheme. So we can therefore say that this poem consists of a set of 8 lines, known as an octave, oct Latin for 8, followed by a set of 6 lines, known as a sestet, ses Latin for 6. Poems with this structure are known as Italian or Petrarchan sonnets, because the Italian author Petrarch originally used this structure in order to write his sonnets. The change in theme and content between line 8 at the end of the octave and the start of line 9, which is the beginning of the sestet, has a technical name of a volta, V-O-L-T-A, which means jump in Italian. Here the volta begins with dear child, and it is emphasized by Wordsworth's use of the exclamation mark. And as we go on to discuss the content, I hope you will see how closely the content is linked to the structure, the rhythm, and the rhyme scheme. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. The broad sun is sinking down in its tranquility. In these lines 1 to 4 of the octave, you need to remember that the first 8 lines of the poem deal with Wordsworth's feeling that when he is in a place of great natural beauty, like the French coastline at Calais, he can actually feel the presence of God or the divine. In line 1, he sets the scene, saying that it is a beautiful evening, calm and free. The word beauteous is just an archaic word. Remember, archaic language is older English that we don't typically use anymore, meaning beautiful. And it wouldn't have been archaic in Wordsworth's time because obviously he wrote this a long time ago in 1820, and that was how they spoke. Think about the connotations of free. The word free implies that Wordsworth was not feeling trapped or oppressed in any way. From a religious perspective, he was implying a belief that his soul was in God's care and that he was free of evil and suffering as he walked along the beach. In line 2, he describes that moment as a holy time, again highlighting how he felt that he was in the presence of God. He uses a simile where he compares the peace, tranquility, and connection to God with the quietness of a nun breathless with adoration. Nuns are members of a religious community of women that have typically taken vows or made promises to dedicate their whole lives to serving and loving God. And you can see a picture of a nun on the bottom left-hand corner. So in this simile, Wordsworth describes the evening as though it is a nun that is experiencing a moment of being one with God that leaves her breathless because she loves and adores God so much. And of course, he's using the extended metaphor of all of nature worshiping God, and that runs through the whole poem. This experience of God is described in the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah as being an overwhelming experience of extreme joy, bordering on ecstasy being overwhelming joy. And to give you an idea of how extreme this emotion was believed to be, I've included a photograph of the artist Bellini's sculpture of a nun. This was St. Teresa at the moment she was experiencing the presence of God. Just look at her body language and her facial expression in that photograph on the right. In that photograph, the angel with the arrow, by the way, represents that this experience is so overwhelming, it's almost painful. The broad sun in these lines is personified as bowing or kneeling down before God in reverence, with the words sinking down in line 4. Again, the extended metaphor of nature worshipping God. To bow or to kneel is how a nun would typically show respect while praying, so that continues that extended metaphor of the praying nun. Broad in line 3 is another archaic or older English word that means wide or large, but it also has connotations of being majestic or cosmic or universal in scale, emphasizing how great God is, that even the sun bows down in reverence before him. The word tranquility means calm or peace and has connotations of being emotionally at peace. Notice how Wordsworth has used this incredibly long sentence that's split using enjambment over the whole 8 lines of the octave. The different main clauses and ideas are then separated with semicolons. That's that punctuation mark that looks like a full stop balanced on top of a comma that's at the end of lines 1 and 4. That use of a very long sentence, the slow rhythm that's emphasized by the long vowel sounds, and the use of iambic pentameter, remember the didum rhythm because of stressed and unstressed syllables, all help to build a mood of peace and tranquility. The poet's use of visual sensory imagery, where he describes what he sees, and auditory imagery, where he describes how quiet it is, both reinforce his tone of reverence and awe in the face of such beauty, and the sense that the whole of creation is a reflection of God, and that God works constantly through nature. Remember that Wordsworth was celebrated for his radical simplicity, his emotional depth, his reverence of the natural world, and his descriptions of ordinary things. I mean, here he's describing a walk on the beach, so that they become extraordinarily significant. A walk on the beach becomes a moment of cosmic revelation and connection with God and the divine. The octave continued, lines 4 to 8. The gentleness of heaven broods o'er the sea. Listen, the mighty being is awake, and doth with his eternal motion make a sound like thunder everlastingly. So as you can hear from these lines, Wordsworth is commenting on the power of heaven, and he uses a metaphor of heaven being a gentle force that broods o'er the sea in line 5. The word brood has two appropriate meanings here. To brood can mean to think very deeply, and the implication there is that God, represented by heaven, is thinking deeply about creation, and the earth, represented by the sea. Note that those are both examples of synecdoche, where a part of something represents the much greater whole. So the whole of the earth represented by the sea, and God represented by heaven or the sky. Because the brooding described here is also associated with gentleness, the gentleness of heaven, there is a sense of great care being taken of creation. To brood can also be a term for how a chicken or a bird will sit on top of its eggs to protect them and keep them warm until they're ready to hatch. That's that image on the left. If the metaphor in line 5 is understood in this sense, it is also an image that implies great love and care. And notice that line 5 ends with a colon, which indicates that further explanation or detail is going to follow. Line 6 marks a change in tone and rhythm. The word listen is a short one, and it's followed by an exclamation mark. And as it is a verb, this means that it's an urgent command, and the poet is commanding his daughter, and also the secondary audience of the reader, to listen. Notice that this is written in the imperative voice. It's giving a command or an order. And also that the rhythm has sped up, which increases that sense of urgency and shifts the mood from one of peaceful silence to something more overwhelming, even perhaps a little bit frightening. The poet goes on to explain what we should be listening to, the sound made by the mighty being. Notice that being is written with a capital, which means that he is referring directly to God. But he's also talking about the sea, which never stops moving. It is in a state of eternal motion and makes a loud noise as the waves break on the shore, a sound like thunder in line 8, which never stops. It continues everlastingly. So we've got to ask ourselves, does this mean that Wordsworth worshipped the sky, which represents heaven, and the sea or nature in general? No, it simply means that he saw the evidence of God in the sky and the sea, and saw God as working through nature, and believed that everything in existence exists because of God. He's saying that God is what keeps the sea in a state of eternal, perpetual motion, that everlastingly and that eternal motion, and that the sea and the scale of the cosmos are evidence of God. Notice how the idea of God, the mighty being awake, rhymes with the word make in the next line. And that rhyme links two very important ideas, that God's presence and activity, his being awake, is exactly what causes the eternal motion. It's what his eternal motion make, and what makes his creation function for eternity, everlastingly. You could suggest that Wordsworth was something of a pantheist, Pantheist is a word that comes from the ancient Greek, where pan means all or everything, and theos means God. So pantheists therefore believe that God is part of everything, and everything in existence is part of God. God and his creation are inseparable. God is not a separate being, but is the totality of everything in existence. Notice how Wordsworth's tone is similar to that of a priest or a pastor. It's almost as though he's preaching, and that the whole of nature is a sacred space like a cathedral or a mosque. Also note how he uses a dash to create a long pause or a caesura in line 8 before he says everlastingly, which highlights that the work and presence of God is eternal. He also contracted over to o'er in line 5 so that it would create that 10-syllable per line iambic rhythm. And did you notice how that regular iambic rhythm is mimetic, or copies the motion and sound of the sea? You know, it has that regular back and forth heartbeat feel to it. It also reinforces Wordsworth's idea that the movement of the sea is also the regular motion of God at constant work in our universe. The sestet, which is the last 6 lines of the poem, changes the focus of the poem. From focusing on the sense of the universal and awesome presence of God, Wordsworth turns to his daughter who's walking with him and writes far more personal lines. In lines 9 to 11, he notices that she does not seem to sense God in the same way that he does. He exclaims, "Dear child, dear girl," using language that was typical of ordinary speech at the time. His words highlight how much he loves her and describes the simple scene of her walking with him on the beach. Remember that walkest is the archaic form of walks, and thou means you. And how he notices that she does not seem to be thinking seriously and philosophically like he is. The poet starts line 10 with if, which means that this line is written in the subjunctive voice or mood of the verb. Remember that a sentence that is in the subjunctive mood suggests a wish or a possibility. In lines 10 and 11, Wordsworth argues that just because his daughter seems not to notice that she is surrounded by the presence of God, and that she is not thinking such deep and serious thoughts as her father, this does not mean that her nature is less divine. She's not less holy because of her ignorance. Line 11 ends in a colon, as in lines 12 to 14, Wordsworth will explain to his daughter, because he's actually talking to her, and also secondarily to you, his readers, why she is just as holy and close to God as her father is, but for very different reasons. Remember that a person's nature is those characteristics that make them who they are, and those are inner characteristics that shape how they think, feel, and behave. Because a person's nature is fundamentally who they are, nobody can change it. So he's saying that she is fundamentally, unchangeably divine, in the sense of being completely innocent and completely holy because she is a child. In the sestet, from lines 12 to 14, Wordsworth continues to explain why his daughter's nature is divine, despite the fact that she does not consciously seem to be aware of God or God's presence in the world. When Wordsworth says, "Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year," he's alluding to the story of Abraham in the Bible. Muslims, Jews, and Christians consider the prophet Abraham to be the father of their religious faith. Jews and Muslims would call him Ibrahim, but it's the same person, and one of the prophets that is closest to God in heaven. Generally, when a person is said to be in Abraham's bosom, it means something similar to they are resting with the angels or they are resting in peace. It usually means that that person has died and that Abraham is embracing them in heaven against his chest, which is what bosom means. And you can have a look at the picture on the left. Being in Abraham's bosom also means to metaphorically be in Abraham's heart or be much loved and approved of by Abraham. Obviously, only holy, sinless people ever attain that state of grace or go to heaven once they've died. When the poet says that his daughter Caroline liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, he is not saying that she's dead. She's not dead. She's walking with him on the beach. Instead, he's implying that she doesn't even have to die to get close to God, heaven, and Abraham. As a child, she's so pure and innocent that she's already in this state all the time or all the year. The image that describes her as being a person who worships at the temple's inner shrine is another biblical allusion to his daughter's state of absolute purity and holiness. In the Jewish faith and the Christian Old Testament, the first temple in Jerusalem was built by King David's son Solomon, according to God's strict commands. The very central room in the temple held the Ark of the Covenant in a space known as the Holy of Holies. This space represented the presence of God with his people, and it was regarded as the holiest place on earth. You can see a model of the temple in the picture on the right. The Holy of Holies was considered to be so holy that the only person who could enter it was the high priest, and he could only enter it on one day of the year to clean the space and offer a sacrifice. You might be interested to know that when he entered the Holy of Holies, he actually had a rope tied around his ankle that he left trailing into the outer temple, so that if he had a heart attack or a stroke or died for some reason in there, he could be pulled out again without anyone else having to enter the space. When Wordsworth says that his daughter worships at the temple's inner shrine, he is saying that she's pure and holy enough to worship in the Holy of Holies at the very center of God's temple. She is as pure as the most holy figure in the Old Testament and as pure as God's most senior servant, the high priest. Remember that an allusion is a reference to a text that's outside of the poem, and that lines 12 and 13 are both allusions to the Old Testament in the Bible. The final line, line 14, sums up Wordsworth's reasons for describing his daughter in this way. God is with her all the time, even when adults do not realize this or cannot recognize this fact, when we know it not. He's still talking to his daughter, so he addresses her as thee, which is you when you're using it as the object of a sentence. The we refers to Wordsworth and other adults. Wordsworth is illustrating the idea that children and adults understand God and draw close to God in very different ways. Children are so pure and innocent that they're always in the presence of God, and they always have an unconscious spiritual connection to God that allows them to simply experience God without having to think about it or work for that experience or use language to explain it. This idea was typical of the Romantics because they thought that children have an instinctive wisdom and a purity that adults lose as they grow up. This is why Wordsworth implies that adults have to approach God through deep thought and contemplations. Adults have to think and work for an experience of God because adults lack a childlike innocence and purity. Ironically, in these lines, adults are portrayed as more ignorant than children because children always experience God, and adults sometimes don't even realize the connection between children and God. Did you notice how the volta between the octave and the sestet illustrates a change in tone from Wordsworth being awestruck at the beauty of nature to admiring of his daughter and somewhat critical of himself and all adults? It also marks a change in focus, from Wordsworth's experience of God working through nature and a sense of cosmic reverence that he felt in the octave, to a far more personal reflection on his daughter's divine nature that he explains and describes in the sestet. Question for discussion. Wordsworth was famous for seeing the divine in the ordinary. With reference to Wordsworth's use of structure, imagery, and tone in It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free, critically assess the validity of the statement in relation to the poem. Justify your response. Okay, so before you start answering a question, you must make sure that you understand the technical language used. Validity means the truth or accuracy of a statement, and justify means give evidence for your ideas and take the evidence from the poem. The structure of a poem refers to the way that it is built or constructed and means that you need to consider things like the form of the poem. So ask yourself, is it an elegy, a protest poem, a lyric, a ballad, a sonnet? You need to think about the rhyme scheme and rhythm and how these aspects are related to the content of the poem. Tone is the emotions that an author or speaker conveys with their words. And tone is related to mood, but is not identical, because mood is the way that a reader or audience is made to feel. And unlike with tone, no speaker is necessary for mood. Imagery refers to figures of speech like sensory imagery, metaphors, similes, and personification. I'm only going to give you some suggestions of things you could comment on if you were asked to write this poetry essay in the exams. And I will talk you through the process of structuring a poetry essay as I discuss a possible answer. An introduction to a literature essay, as you know, should always include your hypothesis. And your hypothesis is the big idea that you are setting out to prove. Start your hypothesis with the name of the text and the author, and then rephrase the question as a statement. In this way, you will hopefully stick to the question throughout your essay, because this statement is what you are going to be trying to prove throughout your essay. You must also include a sentence where you explain how you will structure your essay. Notice that your introduction is very short, 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So this would be my model introduction. It is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free by William Wordsworth is an example of a poem where Wordsworth elevates an ordinary walk on the beach to the level of an experience of the divine. This can clearly be seen in the structure, imagery, and tone of the poem. Notice that in my overview statement, I said that I would discuss structure, imagery, and tone. Therefore, the body of my essay should consist of 3 paragraphs, 1 on structure, 1 on imagery, and 1 on tone. And in each paragraph, I need to specifically show how Wordsworth sees divinity in an ordinary experience, because that was my hypothesis, and it is the focus of the question. Each paragraph should contain at least 1 argument that proves my hypothesis. And remember that an argument always consists of a point you want to prove, evidence from the poem that supports or proves that point, and an explanation of how your evidence proves the point. To remember the structure of an argument, remember the acronym PEE, where P is for point, E is for evidence, and the second E is for explanation. And you can always add an L for a linking sentence to the next paragraph. Listen out for my PEEL or PEEL structure as I suggest what each paragraph could consist of. So my first paragraph is going to focus on structure. The structure of the poem clearly illustrates Wordsworth's tendency to see the divine in the ordinary. The poem is structured as a Petrarchan or Italian sonnet with 14 lines, the use of iambic pentameter throughout, and a rhyme scheme that effectively splits it into an octave followed by a sestet. A sonnet would ordinarily focus on the object of the poet's romantic love, but this poem instead focuses on the poet and his daughter's experience and love of God. In this way, Wordsworth elevates the ordinary and secular focus of a sonnet, which is normally a love poem to another human being, to a focus on the divine, and the sonnet becomes a love poem to God. In terms of the content and the structure, the octave focuses on Wordsworth's experience of God in nature during an ordinary walk on the beach. The octave starts off with a comment on the beauty of his surroundings. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. But it soon moves into a commentary on how nature seems to worship God, implied in line 2. The holy time is as quiet as a nun. In describing the moment of sunset as a holy time and explaining how the broad sun is sinking down, Wordsworth continues with an extended metaphor that describes how nature is worshipping God. He continues to elevate an ordinary walk on the beach to a meditation on the nature of divinity when he comments on his daughter's response to God and nature in the sestet. The volta of dear child, dear girl emphasizes the very ordinary use of language from a loving father to his 9-year-old daughter. Again, Wordsworth shifts the ordinary into a discussion of the divine, as he continues to discuss with her his belief that even though she does not seem to consciously think about God, her purity and innocence mean that she has an instinctive and unconscious connection with the divine that he actually seems to envy. This shift from the cosmic and the universal perception of the divine in the octave to seeing it in his personal relationship with his daughter in the sestet is mirrored by the change in Wordsworth's imagery. So now that was my linking sentence, and I'm on to my second paragraph, which is about imagery. In the octave, his imagery highlights a sense of vastness and awe in the face of infinity. The sun, which is described as broad, which has connotations of cosmic scale, seems to bow down before God. This is a continuation of the metaphor of the holy time of sunset, being like a nun having an ecstatic experience of the divine, as described in line 3 as breathless with adoration. The sea and sky is used as a synecdoche for God, who is described as the gentleness of heaven and brooding over the sea. To brood has connotations of a bird looking after and protecting its eggs until they're ready to hatch, which implies that God looks after and loves his creation. The sea seems to be a synecdoche for the energy of the universe, which Wordsworth implies continuously comes from God. This is implied in lines 6 to 8, where the mighty being, with a capital B, is described as awake and moving and constantly expressing himself through the eternal movement of the sea, with the line, his eternal motion make a sound like thunder everlastingly. This does not imply that Wordsworth worships the sea, but rather that he sees God in his creation and as animating and present in all the natural beauty that surrounds the poet. The imagery of the sestet focuses inwards and examines Wordsworth's daughter Caroline's experience of God. At first, Wordsworth notices that she seems to share none of his awe for the beauty of the evening or his feeling that they are surrounded by the divine and by God. He says she is untouched by solemn thought. However, Wordsworth describes her as being in Abraham's bosom and says that she worships in the temple's innermost shrine, both biblical allusions that imply that she has never lost her connection to God or the divine, and that she lives this experience all the year, or in other words, that she is always divine. My third body paragraph would be about tone and might go something like this. The poet's tone also shifts. His tone in the octave is reverential and is reinforced by diction such as holy, none, adoration, heaven, and being, with a capital B to denote that the poet is referring to God. All of these words have connotations of a deeply religious experience. The tone in the sestet is far more personal, and the shift starts with his direct and loving address to his daughter, which is in the second person. In other words, he is using you, or thee and thou in this poem. Dear child and dear girl, and his admiring tone when he describes her nature. Thy nature is not therefore less divine. And his tone actually becomes faintly critical of adults and their assumption that age and sophistication makes them closer to God. This can be seen in the final line where he says, God being with thee when we know it not. Here he emphasizes that God is always with his daughter, and that adults are sometimes unable to know or see this. Again, Wordsworth's tone throughout the poem shows how he saw and valued the divine in the ordinary, particularly in his daughter, where God was less obvious than in the sense of cosmic awe created by an overwhelmingly beautiful landscape. Finally, your conclusion is a short summary of why your hypothesis is correct. My conclusion could be something like the following. Based on the poet's use of structure and how it is linked to and reinforces his shift in imagery and tone from a sense of cosmic and universal awe to a deep appreciation of his daughter's childlike innocence and experience of God, it is obvious that in A Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free, Wordsworth was seeing the divine in the ordinary, a walk on a beautiful beach with his 9-year-old daughter. Remember, you don't have to say that a statement in an essay like this is totally true or valid, or totally false and invalid. You can take a yes and no approach. Here I said that the statement was totally valid or true, and then I proceeded to argue that. Notice that I did not contradict my hypothesis that I'd given in my introduction with the arguments in the body of my essay. To do so is a major academic error, and if you find that you are arguing against your hypothesis, you need to either change your arguments or change your hypothesis. You also do not have to agree with my views. You could have totally different opinions and also get an essay like this marked as getting 100% and being the right answer. This is because in English, the only correct answers are those that you can prove with evidence from the text. And as I've said before, you can use this structure to write any literary essay or any other discursive essay. For example, history essays or discursive or argumentative essays, if that's the kind of essay you would like to write in Section A of the Creative Writing Examination. I will create a specific video on discursive essay writing, but I hope that this gives you a quick and hopefully helpful formula that you can use throughout your literature exams. The vocabulary that is listed in this slide and in those that follow is listed in the order in which it is used. Check that you understand each word, make sure that you can spell it correctly, and then I hope you enjoy using it when you're talking about this poem. And I will just read the vocabulary out to you so that you know how to spell it. If you don't know what a word means, please go back in the presentation, and I would have explained its meaning at the time when I actually used it. So general vocabulary, romantic poet, vocabulary about structure, Petrarchan sonnet, syllable and syllable break, iambic pentameter, rhythm and rhythm scheme, regular rhyme, half rhyme or slipped rhyme, octave, sestet, verse, stanza, volta, enjambment, punctuation including colons, semicolons and dashes, diction including archaic language, the mood of the verb, which can be imperative when giving commands, subjunctive when suggesting possibilities, interrogative when asking questions, and indicative when giving information. Other useful vocabulary is around figures of speech used in the poem. Please make sure that you don't mix up figures of speech with parts of speech. Parts of speech are things like nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So the figures of speech that I referred to were synecdoche, caesura, mimesis, sensory imagery, symbols and symbolism, mood and tone, irony, metaphors, similes, extended metaphors and personification, and connotations and implications. Useful vocabulary when you're talking about phonic devices are listed on this slide. Remember that phonic devices are devices that affect the way that a poem sounds when it is read out loud. And in an assessment, you will be asked specifically for phonic devices. Don't talk about phonic devices when you are asked about figures of speech. So there's rhyme. Remember, you can spell it. Rhyme has you and me. And I've highlighted the letters in the memory mnemonic there for you to have a look at. Rhythm, which can be spelt as rhythm has your two hips moving. Alliteration, assonance, and onomatopoeia. I might not have specifically mentioned all of these, but that doesn't mean that they aren't used in the poem and that you can't be asked about them. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I have created this channel so that any learner or teacher who is working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to detailed teaching and learning materials. If you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe, and pass the link on to any of your friends who would find this useful. You are also welcome to make a small donation to support this work, although you are not expected to. To do so, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. Most importantly, please like and subscribe and share the link so that you can share the love. Thank you.